We're tackling Plato's Republic.
Warfare in the ideal city, to be
Well,
exact.
I gotta say, this text, it can be a real head-scratcher sometimes, but that's Plato for you.
Oh, yeah.
Always got to keep us on our toes.
Exactly. He makes you think, and that's the point.
Absolutely. And you know what's really striking to me? Plato, he doesn't just see war as a necessary evil or whatever.
Yeah.
It's woven into the very fabric of his perfect state. Like it actually shapes those guardians, the protectors.
It's truly remarkable how he goes deep into the specifics, like who should be the ones fighting, how they should be trained, even how they should treat their enemies.
Yeah, it's like he's writing like a military manual or something.
Yeah.
But with this whole philosophical layer, it's so Plato.
Yeah, totally.
And speaking of those guardians, Socrates, he makes this point about how they should live these super restrained lives, almost
Almost like Spartans, you could say.
yeah, like Spartans. They're supposed to put duty above everything else, like wealth or personal power, which, I mean, makes you wonder, could that even exist in today's world?
Yeah, that's the real kicker, isn't it? Because in our world, power and wealth, they're pretty much intertwined.
Yeah.
But Plato, he's building this system where the guardians are driven by this sense of justice, this responsibility, not by what they can gain personally. So they're not just soldiers. They're more like, I don't know, the ultimate public servants or something.
It's a pretty radical idea.
For sure.
And then he drops this other bombshell.
Yeah.
Women should be guardians too.
Yeah.
Whoa. Can you imagine how that must have sounded back then?
Oh, absolutely. It would have been completely revolutionary. In ancient Greece, women were mostly confined to the home.
Right.
But Socrates, he flips the script. He challenges those traditional roles head on. He says, women, if they're given the same training and same opportunities, they can be just as capable as men when it comes to protecting the city.
Yeah, it's like he's saying the soul of a guardian. It doesn't have a gender. Makes you think, what if history had taken a different turn? Right?
Definitely, what if?
But he doesn't stop there. Oh, no. Socrates then goes on to suggest that, get this, that children should be brought to observe battles.
Wow.
Like safe ones, of course.
Yeah.
But still pretty controversial, don't you think?
Whoa, yeah, for sure. That was definitely not typical. Exposing kids to war, not exactly standard Greek practice, but Socrates, he believed in this early exposure thing. Let them see the reality of war. That way they really understand what it means. The sacrifice, the gravity of their future role.
I guess I could see how it could instill a sense of duty and all that, but I don't know. Was that mess them up a bit?
Yeah, it's a tough one, even today. Trying to find that balance between educating them, but also not traumatizing them. But to be fair, Plato, he stresses that this wouldn't be some free-for-all. It would be controlled.
Yeah.
Experienced commanders would make sure the kids were only observing battles deemed safe.
So it's more like a controlled glimpse into their future world.
Exactly. Not about throwing them into danger.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense. But what about those rewards for bravery that Socrates outlines? Crowns, handshakes, even kisses from everyone.
Seems a bit
over the top.
Yeah, a little bit, maybe.
Especially the kissing part.
But you have to remember, Plato, he's obsessed with this idea of creating the best possible society.
Yeah.
And to him, that means the best people need to reproduce.
Oh, I see.
So it wasn't just about like individual rewards. It was about encouraging the right kind of people to have children.
Like a societal improvement program almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it ties into this whole grand vision he has.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. But it does make you wonder, are those rewards really motivating? Or is real courage something deeper than that?
That's a great question. Think about it. Is it truly brave if you're only doing it for the recognition? Or is there a higher form of courage that comes from within?
I don't know. What do you think?
It seems like Plato's suggesting a bit of both, but then he throws in this other curveball, treating your enemies with humanity, even in war.
Wait, hold on. Treating your enemies with what? Humanity? Isn't the point of war to defeat the enemy?
That's what makes Plato's view so fascinating, because he makes this distinction, especially when it comes to conflicts between Greeks. He's against enslaving fellow Greeks, looting their dead, burning their cities. It's a pretty civilized approach to war, considering.
Yeah, especially for back then. So is this genuine belief in the value of all Greeks? Or is it more a strategic thing?
It could be both, couldn't it?
I guess so.
Remember, Plato's writing at a time when these Greek city-states, they were always fighting each other. He believes in this shared Greek identity, what he calls the Panhellenic ideal. So basically, if you destroy another Greek city, even in war, you're actually weakening the whole Greek world.
Like shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Makes you wonder how many modern conflicts could be seen through that lens.
The idea of shared identity.
But then Plato goes even further.
He does.
He draws this distinction between civil war and just plain war.
Oh, that's right.
So what's the difference?
This is where it gets really deep. See, Plato, he says that conflict between Greek, it's more like a disease, like a sickness in the body politic. It's not a real war.
Okay.
So it needs to be handled differently, with restraint, focus on healing, restoring unity.
Interesting.
But real war, that's for conflicts with outsiders, the barbarians.
So there's a hierarchy of conflict almost?
Exactly.
Internal disagreements, you got to handle them differently than the threats from outside. Makes sense? But does that mean he's okay with being more ruthless against outsiders?
Those are the kinds of questions, right? The questions that have always been with us. And they're especially relevant today. We're still trying to figure out this whole ethics of war thing.
Yeah.
Where's the line? When is force justified? How do we deal with all these different cultures, ideologies? It's messy.
It really is.
But Plato, even with his, ancient perspective, he makes us think about these things, these uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, he definitely gives us a lot to chew on.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? We've covered so much, but there's still so much to unpack.
We've got the guardians, the women warriors, the training of children, the whole humanity and war thing.
We haven't even gotten to the practical stuff yet.
Exactly. Like, how do you actually build this ideal city? Could it ever exist in reality?
Yeah, good question.
We'll dive into all that in our next segment. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Plato's Republic. Last time, we were really getting into it, trying to figure out if this ideal city, this utopia of his, could ever actually exist.
Yeah, we talked about all this radical restructuring of society, these guardians who are supposed to be totally selfless. It all seems, I don't know.
A bit far-fetched.
Yeah, kind of. Are we really supposed to believe people could just give up all their personal ambitions, their desire for a nice house and a fancy chariot?
It definitely pushes the limits of what we think of as human nature.
Yeah.
But to be fair to Plato, even he admitted it would be insanely hard to actually establish this kind of society. I think he even compares it to sculpting a statue out of the toughest, most unyielding material.
So he knew it wouldn't be easy.
Oh, yeah.
But even if, hypothetically, we could somehow get past all those obstacles, the question is, would it even work? Would this utopia really be as harmonious and just as Plato imagines?
That's the question that's kept philosophers arguing for, centuries, right? There's no easy answer. Where would you even start? But if you want to even try to wrap your head around it, you got to look at the potential problems, right?
Yeah.
The cracks in this seemingly perfect system. And for Plato, one of the biggest problems is just human nature itself.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at before. He seems to think you could just, mold people into these perfectly rational, selfless beings. But history shows us that. Maybe not so much.
Yeah, people are complicated, right? We all have our own self-interests. We want recognition. We want things.
Exactly. So even in this perfect utopia, there's a chance all those suppressed desires, they could bubble up in some really unexpected, maybe even dangerous ways.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Sooner or later, it's going to pop back up.
And probably splash you in the face.
Exactly. And that brings us to another potential issue. Too much power in one place. We've talked about those guardians, right? This elite group that runs everything, the government, the military. But who's keeping an eye on them?
Yeah, it's like that saying, power corrupts. Absolute
Yeah.
power corrupts, absolutely.
Exactly. So even if we assume the guardians, they start out with the best intentions, how do you stop them from getting, corrupted by all that power? What if they start putting their own interests first?
Yeah, not a pretty picture. So it seems like even if you could create this ideal city, you would always be teetering on the edge, just waiting for human nature or power to mess everything up.
And that brings us to another interesting part of Plato's vision for this ideal city, the lifestyle he has in mind for these guardians. Socrates, he suggests they should all live together, like a big commune.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, sharing everything, no private property, no individual families, not even their own kids.
Back up. They wouldn't even know who their parents are.
Nope. The kids would be raised all together.
That's a very different definition of community than what I'm used to.
It's definitely a far cry from our individualistic societies. But Plato's argument is that, by getting rid of all these individual attachments, desires, the guardians can be completely focused on the good of the city.
I guess that makes sense. But
Yeah.
doesn't that kind of ignore a pretty big part of being human? What about personal freedom, identity? Can you just erase those things?
It's a question a lot of people have wrestled with over the years. Plato saw this communal living thing as the way to achieve true justice, harmony. But his critics, they say it could just lead to this boring uniformity.
Yeah, everyone thinking the same, acting the same.
Exactly. It could end up stifling creativity, individuality. It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is.
Oh.
But let's say, just for fun, that we go along with this whole communal living thing. How does it actually work on the battlefield?
Oh, that's actually a key part of Plato's thinking. See, he believed that when you take away all those personal attachments, possessions, you make the guardians fearless.
Because they've got nothing to lose.
Exactly, except for the city itself.
So it creates this incredibly strong bond between the guardians and the city. They become the embodiment of its will. It's its ultimate protectors.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Makes sense. And remember, this includes the women warriors too, right?
That's right. Plato makes a point of saying that once women are free from those traditional roles, the domestic stuff, they can be just as capable as men in defending the city.
We talked about that earlier, but I'm still amazed by how radical that was for the time. Do you think he really believed in complete equality between men and women?
That's a question scholars are still debating. Some say he was a product of his time, right? So he couldn't completely escape those patriarchal views. But others think that, no, he actually saw the potential in women if they were given the right opportunities.
It's hard to know for sure. But let's get back to the battlefield. So we've talked about the training, the mindset, the whole communal living thing. What about how they actually fight? Are there rules?
Oh, yeah. This is where we get into what Plato considered a just war. He lays out some specific guidelines for how those guardians should behave, and they might actually surprise you.
Oh, how?
For one thing, he really stresses restraint. He says the guardians should never be cruel or destructive just for the sake of it. Their main goal is to protect the city, not to cause suffering.
No, looting and pillaging, burning villages to the ground.
No, not at all.
That seems pretty enlightened, especially compared to how brutal ancient warfare usually was.
Remember, Plato's all about justice, virtue, building this perfect society. And that applies even in war. He thinks you can fight honorably, stick to your ideals.
That's a nice thought, but isn't it naive? War is messy. It's
Yeah.
brutal.
He knew that.
How can you expect soldiers to keep their morals straight when they're in the thick of it?
It's definitely a challenge, but Plato insisted that the guardian should be driven by a desire for justice, not revenge or bloodlust.
So they're not just warriors, they're like philosopher warriors, thinking about ethics even while they're fighting. It's a cool concept, but I don't know how realistic it is.
It's a high bar for sure. And that actually leads us to another kind of controversial part of Plato's vision, the difference he sees between fighting other Greeks and fighting barbarians.
He's got different rules depending on who the enemy is. Why is that?
Remember that Pan-Hellenic ideal we were talking about?
Yeah, the shared Greek identity thing.
Exactly. So for Plato, conflict between Greeks, it's like a civil war, something that needs to be resolved with as little bloodshed as possible.
Yeah.
And then focus on healing, reconciliation.
So it's more like a family argument. You don't want to cause permanent damage.
Exactly. He even says that the guardians should avoid destroying Greek cities if they can and treat captured Greek soldiers with respect. He's thinking about the long-term unity of the Greek world, not just winning a single battle.
That's a pretty amazing perspective, considering how much they were fighting amongst themselves back then.
But then you get to warfare against those outside the Greek world, the barbarians.
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little uncomfortable.
It does, yeah. Plato sees that as a completely different kind of conflict. It's about defending Greek civilization from these outside threats, and he seems to view barbarians as fundamentally different.
So he's basically saying it's okay to be more ruthless with them.
It's definitely a problem from our modern perspective, right?
Yeah.
It almost sounds like early racism or something.
Like one culture is just better than another.
You gotta remember, Plato was writing in a specific time and place. The Greeks, they saw themselves as the most civilized people, surrounded by these less developed cultures.
I get it, but it still clashes with all those enlightened ideas about how to treat other Greeks.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It shows you how even the smartest people, they're still influenced by their time.
It's a good reminder to be critical of even the greatest thinkers. But it also shows how relevant Plato still is. We're still wrestling with those same questions about just war, about how to deal with different cultures.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep studying these old texts.
Because they force us to think about those big questions.
Exactly. Those questions that never really go away. Where do we go from here? We've talked about guardians, just war, barbarians. But can any of this really work? Can Plato's vision ever really exist outside philosophy book?
That's the big one, isn't it? And that's exactly what we'll be tackling in our final segment.
Welcome back. So we've been on this wild ride through Plato's Republic, right? Talking about guardians, just war, barbarians, all this.
Yeah, it's been intense.
It has. But the big question that's still hanging out there is, can any of this actually work in the real world? It's a beautiful vision, but
Yeah, it's pretty out there.
can you really build a society based on these perfect ideals?
Exactly. Is that what Plato was actually trying to do? Did he really think someone could pick up his book and go, okay, let's build this utopia?
That's a good question. And honestly, philosophers have been debating that for, ever. Plato himself said it would be incredibly difficult. He even compared it to trying to sculpt something out of this super hard, unyielding material.
But you knew it wouldn't be easy.
Oh, no, not at all. But let's just say, for a minute, that we could pull it off. We find our perfect philosopher kings. Everyone's living in communes. No one's selfish anymore. Would it actually work? Would we finally have that harmony, that justice that Plato was so obsessed with?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and there's no simple answer. But maybe the best way to look at the Republic is not as some kind of literal instruction manual, but more like a thought experiment.
Oh, okay.
He's exploring what a just society could look like and all the problems that come with trying to actually make it happen.
It's more about the journey than the destination, kinda.
Yeah, I think so. It's about asking the right questions, getting us to think critically about justice, government, human nature, all those big things.
And those are questions we're still asking today, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. Plato's talking about this idea of the common good, right? And even though his commune idea is, maybe a little extreme,
Yeah, a little bit.
it makes you think about that balance between what individuals want and what's best for society as a whole.
Yeah, and that's a debate we're still having today.
Totally. Individual rights versus the needs of the community, the role of government, how to share resources fairly. Plato's Republic, even if we could never actually build it, it gives us this framework for thinking about those issues.
That's a good point. And what about that whole philosopher king thing?
Yeah.
Come on, a ruler who's both powerful and wise sounds like a fantasy.
Oh, yeah, maybe it is. But it highlights something important, right? That
Yeah.
we should be looking for leaders who are ethical, who actually want to serve the people, not just themselves.
So even if we can't find a perfect philosopher king, the idea itself is like a reminder of what good leadership should look like.
Exactly. And don't forget about education. Plato was really big on that. He didn't just see it as cramming facts into people's heads. It was about shaping character, instilling a love of wisdom, teaching people how to be virtuous.
So it was about building good citizens.
Exactly. And that's something that's still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
The idea that education can transform people and ultimately transform societies.
It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe Plato's Republic is a bit of a pipe dream, but it still has a lot to teach us.
Oh, absolutely. It reminds us that we should always be striving for justice, wisdom, a society that puts people first.
Yeah. And even if we never reach that perfect ideal, the act of striving, of trying to get closer, that's what really matters.
I think so. That's the whole point of philosophy, right? To challenge us, make us think about the big picture.
You've definitely challenged me today. It's been a really thought-provoking discussion. We've talked about some pretty complex stuff, but I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too. Plato always does that. He gets you thinking.
He sure does. To everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Republic. It's been a wild ride, but hopefully you've come away with some new ideas, new perspectives. And keep those conversations going. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep seeking wisdom.
That's what it's all about.
Absolutely.